September 14, 1943. The Italian coastline near Salerno. The water is cold. Not the cold that makes you gasp, but the kind that seeps into your bones slowly, the kind that makes you forget what warmth ever felt like. Sergeant Thomas Harrington of the British 46th Infantry Division treads water in the darkness, watching the transport ship burn against the night sky. The flames create their own terrible light, orange and violent, turning the Mediterranean into something biblical. He cannot hear anything except the roar of the fire and the sound of his own breathing inside his head. Around him, men are screaming. Some are drowning. Some are already dead, floating face down in the dark water, their bodies rising and falling with the waves like terrible debris. Thomas swims away from the flames, away from the noise, toward the darker water where the fire hasn't reached yet. His rifle is gone. His pack is gone. He wears only his uniform and the weight of everything he's lost. The shore is somewhere ahead in the darkness. He swims toward it without thinking, propelled only by the body's insistence on survival, that animal reflex that precedes all philosophy and all despair. When his feet finally touch sand, he crawls forward on his hands and knees, vomiting seawater onto the beach. The sky above him is turning gray with false dawn. He lies there in the sand, coughing, feeling the weight of his sodden uniform pressing him down into the earth. And then he hears German voices. They come from somewhere behind the dunes, sharp and efficient in the morning quiet. Thomas doesn't move. He presses himself flat against the cold sand, his cheek against small stones and salt, and he waits. His heart hammers against his ribs with such force he thinks they must be able to hear it. Two soldiers appear over the rise, their rifles pointed at nothing in particular, their eyes scanning the beach. They are young. Perhaps 20. Perhaps younger. They wear the field gray of the Wehrmacht, their uniforms clean in a way Thomas's hasn't been clean for weeks. One of them sees him immediately. The other one follows his gaze. They do not shout. They simply walk toward him, their boots crunching on the coarse sand, their rifles now pointing directly at his head. Thomas raises his hands slowly. He is too tired to feel fear in the way fear is supposed to feel. Instead, he feels only a kind of numb acceptance, the sense that whatever happens next was already decided somewhere else by someone else a long time ago. Aufstehen, one of them says. Stand up. Thomas stands. His legs shake. Water drips from his uniform in dark streams, pooling at his feet. The two soldiers look at him with neither hatred nor sympathy. They look at him the way one looks at a problem that must be solved quickly and without fuss. One of them gestures with his rifle toward the road beyond the dunes. Thomas begins walking. Behind him, the transport ship continues to burn, and he does not turn around to look at it again. The prison camp sits in the hills above Salerno, a collection of wooden barracks surrounded by barbed wire and guard towers. It had been an Italian army base before the armistice, and it still carries the Mediterranean flavor of its original purpose. Whitewashed walls, terracotta tiles, small windows that look out onto olive groves and distant mountains. But the wire is German now. The guards are German. The efficiency is German. Thomas arrives with 37 other prisoners, all of them survivors from the transport, all of them hollow-eyed and silent. They march through the gates in a ragged column, their wet uniforms steaming slightly in the afternoon heat, their faces blank with exhaustion and shock. Inside the camp, a German officer addresses them in careful English. His accent is thick but his grammar is precise. He tells them the rules. He tells them the consequences of breaking the rules. He tells them they will be treated according to the Geneva Convention, that they will receive food and shelter and medical attention, that the war is not personal, that they are now simply men removed from the machinery of conflict. Thomas listens but does not hear. He stares at the officer's boots, at the way they shine even in the dust, at the way nothing about this man suggests he has ever known chaos or terror or the cold grip of seawater pulling him down. The prisoners are separated into groups and assigned to different barracks. Thomas finds himself in Barrack 7 with 12 other men, mostly infantry soldiers like himself, one sergeant from an artillery unit, one lieutenant with a badly burned hand who will not speak to anyone. The barracks are clean. Austere but clean. Each man receives a metal bed frame, a thin mattress, 2 blankets, a metal cup. The windows have no glass, only wooden shutters that let in slanted bars of golden light in the afternoons. That first night, Thomas lies on his bunk and listens to the sounds of other men breathing in the darkness. Someone coughs. Someone prays quietly in a northern accent he cannot place. The lieutenant with the burned hand makes a soft whimpering sound, then stops as if remembering where he is. Thomas closes his eyes but does not sleep. He thinks about the transport ship burning. He thinks about the faces of men drowning in the dark water. He thinks about his rifle which he lost somewhere between the ship and the shore, and he feels shame for reasons he cannot quite articulate. In the morning the guards come to assign work details. His name is Klaus. Oberfeldwebel Klaus Schreiber of the 16th Panzer Division, currently assigned to guard duty at the camp while recovering from a shrapnel wound to his left shoulder. He is 34 years old. He has been a soldier since 1938. He has fought in Poland, in France, in North Africa. He carries himself with the posture of a man who has learned to move through the world without calling unnecessary attention to himself. Thomas meets him on the third day during the morning work detail. The prisoners are digging drainage ditches along the western edge of the camp, preparing for the autumn rains that will turn the hillside into mud. The work is hard but not brutal. The guards allow them to rest every hour, to drink water from metal canteens that taste of rust and iodine. Klaus is assigned to supervise Thomas's section. He stands at the edge of the trench, his rifle slung over his good shoulder, watching the prisoners work with an expression that reveals nothing. He does not shout. He does not threaten. He simply watches, smoking cigarettes one after another, his eyes moving from man to man with methodical attention. Thomas digs without looking up. The earth here is rocky and resistant, full of small stones that make the shovel ring with each strike. His hands blister quickly. He has been a clerk before the war, not a laborer, and his body remembers this with every movement. Around midday, one of the prisoners, a young corporal from Manchester with a badly set broken nose, collapses in the trench. He simply drops his shovel and sits down in the dirt, his head between his knees, his breathing shallow and fast. The other prisoners stop working. They look at the corporal, then at Klaus, then back at the corporal. The air seems to contract, waiting. Klaus steps forward. He looks down at the collapsed man for a long moment. Then he says something in German that Thomas does not understand. The corporal doesn't move. Klaus reaches down and takes the man's arm, not roughly, and helps him stand. He gestures toward the shade of a nearby tree. He hands him a canteen. He says something else in German, and though Thomas cannot understand the words, he can understand the tone. Practical concern, free of theater or malice. The corporal drinks from the canteen. He sits in the shade. Klaus returns to his position at the edge of the trench. The other prisoners resume digging, and Thomas realizes he has been holding his breath. That evening, back in the barracks, the corporal from Manchester tells the story differently. He says Klaus looked at him with contempt. He says the Germans' help was a performance meant to demonstrate superiority. He says you cannot trust any of them, ever, not even when they pretend to be human. The other men nod. They need the story to be this way, Thomas realizes. They need the enemy to be simple, to be wholly other, to be separated from them by a gulf too wide for any bridge. But Thomas remembers the way Klaus reached down for the corporal's arm. He remembers the absence of cruelty in the gesture. He remembers thinking just for a moment that Klaus looked tired in exactly the same way Thomas feels tired. The tiredness that comes not from physical labor but from carrying too much history forward into each new day. 3 weeks pass. The routine of the camp becomes familiar in the way terrible things become familiar when they persist long enough. Wake at dawn. Morning roll call. Work details. Lunch of thin soup and black bread. More work. Evening roll call. Then soup again. Sleep. Thomas is reassigned to a different work detail, repairing the roof of the officer's mess. The work requires going up on ladders, replacing broken tiles, sealing leaks with tar that stinks of petroleum and heat. Klaus supervises this detail as well. They do not speak. Klaus stands below, smoking, occasionally pointing at sections of roof that need attention. Thomas works alongside an older prisoner, a sergeant named Davies, who speaks constantly in a low, bitter monologue about everything he misses, everything he hates, everything he plans to do if he survives. Thomas doesn't listen. He concentrates on the simple geometry of laying tiles, the satisfaction of fitting each piece exactly against its neighbors, the momentary illusion that this small act of repair means something. One afternoon, while Thomas is balanced on a ladder with his hands full of hot tar, the ladder shifts. Not dramatically, just a slight movement, a settling, but enough to send his weight off center. He teeters, overcorrects, and begins to fall. Klaus moves quickly. He drops his cigarette and steps forward, positioning himself below the ladder, his arms raised. Thomas crashes into him with the full weight of his body, and they both go down hard onto the packed earth. For a moment they lie tangled together in the dust. Klaus grunts in pain, his wounded shoulder. Thomas scrambles to separate himself, expecting violence, expecting punishment, expecting the sudden reversal that will reveal this was all a trap designed to manufacture a reason for cruelty. But Klaus only sits up slowly, wincing, and touches his shoulder. He looks at Thomas. Their eyes meet. Neither man speaks. Thomas sees something in Klaus's face that he has not allowed himself to see before. Recognition. Not the recognition of nationality or uniform or ideology, but the simpler recognition of one body that has known pain acknowledging another body that has known pain. Klaus stands. He brushes dust from his uniform. He picks up Thomas's fallen shovel and hands it to him without comment. Then he walks back to his position at the edge of the work area, lights another cigarette, and resumes watching. Davies appears beside Thomas, whispering urgently. You're lucky he didn't shoot you. Clumsy bastard, like you could have killed him. They'd have shot you for that. Thomas doesn't answer. He returns to the ladder. His hands are shaking slightly, and he notices Klaus has noticed this, and he notices Klaus choosing to pretend he hasn't noticed. That night in the barracks, Thomas cannot sleep. He lies on his bunk and tries to understand what happened on the ladder. He tries to fit it into the narrative he has been telling himself about the war, about the enemy, about the simple geometry of good and evil that is supposed to make all of this make sense. The narrative does not accommodate the moment. The moment exists outside of it like a rock in a stream that the water must flow around. It begins with chess. Someone in the camp has managed to fashion a crude chess set from scraps of wood and carved pieces. The set lives in the common area of Barak 7, and men play in the evenings when the work is done and the light still allows it. Thomas has played chess since childhood. His father taught him, patiently correcting his mistakes, showing him how to think 3 moves ahead for moves ahead, how to see the board not as it is but as it could become. One evening, Thomas sits alone with the chess set, replaying a famous game from memory, Lasker vs. Capablanca, 1921. He is concentrating so deeply on the position that he doesn't hear Klaus approach until the German is standing directly beside him. Thomas looks up, startled. Guards are not supposed to enter the barracks except during inspections. The boundary between prisoner and guard is meant to be absolute, to be maintained through distance and protocol and the implicit threat of violence. But Klaus is here in the doorway looking at the chessboard. He says something in German. Thomas stares at him blankly. Klaus tries again, switching to halting, heavily accented English. This game. I know this game. Thomas blinks. You play chess? Ja. Yes. Before the war I play much. Klaus gestures at the board. Lasker. Against Capablanca. St. Petersburg, no? Havana, Thomas corrects automatically. 1921. Klaus nods slowly, impressed. Then he does something that transforms the space between them. He sits down on the bench opposite Thomas, facing the chessboard. They do not speak again for several minutes. Klaus studies the position. Thomas watches Klaus study the position. The boundaries are dissolving, and neither man seems to know how to stop this or whether they want to. Finally Klaus reaches out and moves one of the black pieces. The knight, 3 spaces in its characteristic L shape. He looks at Thomas. Your move. Thomas hesitates. Every rule he knows about survival in the camp tells him to refuse, to maintain the distance, to treat this as a trap or a test or a performance designed to produce some future betrayal. But he is so tired of those rules. He is so tired of the suspicion and the hatred and the reduction of every human interaction to a question of power and submission. He moves a pawn. Klaus counters. They play in silence for 20 minutes, developing their pieces, probing each other's defenses, finding the rhythm that chess creates between 2 minds. Klaus's game is aggressive but not reckless. He favors the Italian opening, pushing his pawns forward quickly to control the center of the board. Thomas responds with the Caro-Kann defense, methodical and solid, designed to absorb pressure without breaking. They finish the game without speaking. Klaus loses, but barely. Thomas forces a checkmate in 37 moves only because Klaus makes a small miscalculation in the endgame, pushing his king too far forward into Thomas's remaining rook. Klaus looks at the board for a long moment after the game ends. Then he says in his careful English, "Good game." "Good game," Thomas echoes. Klaus stands. He adjusts his rifle. He walks back toward the door and Thomas thinks this is the end, that this strange moment of shared concentration will remain isolated, will not repeat. But at the doorway Klaus stops. He turns back. He says, "Tomorrow? After the work? We play again?" Thomas nods. "Yes, tomorrow." Klaus leaves. Thomas sits alone with the chessboard, staring at the pieces, trying to understand what just happened and failing. They play chess every evening for 2 weeks. At first, the other prisoners watch with open hostility. Davies tells Thomas he's collaborating, that he's betraying the unit, that fraternizing with the enemy is a moral offense that will follow him for the rest of his life. But Thomas notices that Davies's voice lacks conviction. He notices that the other men watch the games with a kind of reluctant fascination, as if witnessing something forbidden but not quite able to look away. The games themselves become longer, more complex. Klaus brings his own chess set one evening, a beautiful hand-carved set that must have been made before the war, each piece smooth and weighted and perfect. He sets it up without explanation and they play with these new pieces, and Thomas feels the strange intimacy of touching objects that clearly mean something to Klaus, objects he has carried through campaigns and countries and years. They begin to talk during the games. Not about the war. Never about the war. Klaus talks about his family, his wife in Hamburg, his daughter who is 7 years old and learning to play piano. He talks about his father, who was a schoolteacher who taught Klaus to read Latin and Greek, who believed that education was the only real wealth a man could possess. Thomas talks about his own father, who had been a clerk like Thomas, who had died of pneumonia when Thomas was 16. He talks about growing up in Surrey, about the woods behind his house where he used to build elaborate forts as a child, about the specific quality of light in England that he cannot find anywhere else. They discover they have both read the same books. Klaus loves Goethe and Schiller. Thomas loves Shakespeare and Wordsworth. They argue about poetry with the passion of men who have been starving for this kind of conversation, this meeting of minds that has nothing to do with uniforms or flags or the machinery of violence. One evening Klaus brings bread from the officer's mess, Real bread, white and soft, not the hard black ration bread the prisoners receive. He breaks it in half and offers part to Thomas without ceremony. Thomas accepts it. They eat in silence, and this simple act of sharing food transforms something between them that words could not touch. Davies confronts Thomas that night in the barracks. You think he's your friend? You think because he brings you bread and plays chess that he's somehow different from the rest of them? He's still the enemy, Thomas. He's still the man who will shoot you if someone orders him to. Thomas lies on his bunk, staring at the ceiling. He knows Davies is right. He knows the friendship, if it even deserves that name, exists in a space that has no permanence, no protection, no guarantee of anything beyond the next chess game. But he also knows that Klaus has shown him something real. Not something safe or comfortable, but something real. The possibility that the war has not destroyed everything human, that beneath all the uniforms and ideologies and tribal identities, there are still two men capable of recognizing each other's intelligence, each other's loneliness, each other's need for something more than survival. Winter comes to the Italian hills. The nights turn cold, and the prisoners receive extra blankets but not enough extra blankets. Men begin to cough. The thin soup somehow becomes thinner. Thomas's chess games with Klaus continue, but they are now played inside the guards' building, where there is a small stove that provides warmth. Klaus arranges this without explanation, simply appearing one evening to tell Thomas to follow him. The other guards watch Thomas enter their building with expressions ranging from amusement to disgust. Thomas keeps his eyes down, follows Klaus to a small side room where the chessboard is already set up. They play. They talk. Klaus teaches Thomas a few words of German. Thomas tries to explain English idioms that don't translate. They laugh sometimes quietly, conscious of being overheard. In December, something changes in the camp. A new commandant arrives, a younger officer with sharp eyes and a reputation for strictness. The routines tighten. The work details become longer. The atmosphere becomes charged with unspoken tension. Klaus becomes more distant. He still supervises Thomas's work detail, but he no longer makes eye contact. The chess games stop without explanation. Thomas understands that something has shifted in the power structure of the camp, that Klaus is navigating dangers Thomas cannot see. Then one morning in late December, a prisoner attempts to escape. His name is Private Collins, an 18-year-old from Bristol who has been in the camp only 3 weeks. He makes his attempt during the early morning fog, crawling under the wire while the guards are distracted by a minor dispute in another section of the camp. He almost makes it. He is perhaps 20 meters beyond the perimeter when one of the younger guards spots him and raises the alarm. Thomas is near the wire when it happens. He sees Collins running through the olive grove, sees the guards raising their rifles, sees Klaus standing at the tower with his own rifle pointed at the fleeing figure. Everything slows down. Thomas can hear his own heartbeat. He can hear Collins's boots crushing the frozen grass. He can hear the metallic click of rifle bolts being pulled back. Klaus has a clear shot. The other guards are waiting for him to fire. He is the ranking NCO on duty, the command is his to give. But Klaus does not fire. He lowers his rifle slightly. He shouts something in German. Thomas doesn't understand the words but understands the meaning. Hold your fire. Collins disappears into the deeper grove. The other guards lower their rifles, confused. They look at Klaus. Klaus looks straight ahead, his face expressionless. Later, the commandant summons Klaus to his office. Thomas watches through the window of the barracks as Klaus emerges an hour later, his face pale, his movements stiff. Klaus walks directly to his own quarters without looking at anyone. Collins is recaptured 3 days later by Italian partisans who turn him over to the Germans. He is brought back to the camp in handcuffs. The commandant orders him to be placed in solitary confinement for 1 month. That evening Klaus appears at the barracks. He looks at Thomas for a long moment. Then he says in English, "No more chess." Thomas nods. He understands. Klaus has already risked too much. Klaus turns to leave, then stops. He reaches into his pocket and pulls out something small, a chess piece, the white queen from his hand-carved set. He places it on the bench next to the crude wooden chessboard. "So you remember," Klaus says quietly. "So you remember that some things are more important than the rules we follow." He leaves. Thomas picks up the white queen. It is smooth and weighted and perfect in his hand. He closes his fingers around it and feels something break open inside his chest. Not grief exactly, but something close to grief, the recognition of what has been given and what must now be lost. The Allied invasion comes in January 1944. The camp is evacuated in chaos as the front line moves north. The prisoners are marched inland toward Germany, part of the Great Retreat that will define the final year of the war in Italy. Thomas never sees Klaus again after that day with the chess piece. In the confusion of the evacuation, the guards and prisoners are separated, reorganized, sent in different directions according to the frantic logic of military collapse. Thomas survives. He is transferred to a POW camp in Austria, then another in Germany. He endures the last year of the war in conditions that make the Italian camp seem almost gentle by comparison. He nearly dies of typhus in March 1945. He is liberated by American forces in May, weighing 43 kilograms, unable to walk without assistance. He returns to England in June. He tries to return to his old life as a clerk. He marries a woman named Helen who is kind to him in ways he does not deserve. He has 2 children. He works for 41 years at the same insurance firm. He dies in 1987 of a stroke at home in his sleep. But throughout all of this, through marriage and children and decades of gray ordinary life, he keeps the White Queen in a small wooden box on his desk. Sometimes, late at night when he cannot sleep, he takes it out and holds it in his palm and tries to remember Klaus's face. He never tells his wife the full story. She knows only that it is a chess piece from the war, that it means something to him, that she should not throw it away. He tries, several times over the years, to find out what happened to Klaus Schreiber. He writes letters to German veterans organizations. He contacts the Red Cross. But the war has scattered so many men, has broken so many connections, has made so many records disappear into ash and fire and bureaucratic chaos. He never learns what happened to Klaus. He never learns if Klaus survived, if he returned to Hamburg, if he saw his daughter again, if he ever thought about those chess games in the Italian camp. What Thomas does learn, slowly and painfully over many years, is that the war did not end when the fighting stopped. The war continues in memory, in the way certain faces appear in dreams, in the way certain gestures, the offering of bread, the careful placement of a chess piece, become icons of something that cannot be spoken. He learns that friendship is not measured only in years or in shared safety. Sometimes it is measured in silence, in small acts of mercy, in the choice not to fire a rifle when every rule says you should. He learns that the enemy can become your only friend, and that this does not make the war less terrible. If anything, it makes the war more terrible because it reveals what is being destroyed. Not just nations or ideologies, but the small possibilities of human connection that exist even in the most impossible circumstances. On certain evenings in the last years of his life, Thomas sits in his study with the White Queen in his hand, and he plays through the Lasker Capablanca game in his mind. He remembers every move, every exchange, every turning point. And he remembers Klaus sitting across from him, separated by a wooden chessboard and by everything the world had done to make them enemies, finding for a brief season a language that transcended nation and uniform and hatred. That language was chess. But it was also something more than chess. It was the language of 2 men who had recognized in each other the same exhaustion, the same loneliness, the same desperate need to believe that humanity had not been entirely swallowed by the war. Thomas dies holding the White Queen in his right hand, and his children find it there when they come to prepare the body. They have no idea what it means. They almost throw it away. But Helen, who has been his wife for 42 years, tells them no, tells them their father would have wanted it buried with him. So they place it in the coffin, that small carved piece of wood, that impossible souvenir of friendship between men who should have been only enemies. And if you were to ask Thomas, in that moment before death when consciousness dissolves, what he learned from Klaus, what message he would carry forward from those chess games in the Italian camp, he would tell you this: the war teaches us to hate. It teaches us to see only uniforms, only flags, only the machinery of tribe and nation and blood. But the war cannot entirely destroy the other thing, the older thing, the human capacity to see another person and recognize yourself. That capacity survives, small and quiet and almost invisible, like a White Queen carved from wood and carried for 43 years as proof that even in hell, even when every rule says it is impossible, 2 men can choose to be something more than enemies. They can choose for a brief season to be friends. And that choice, more than any battle or treaty or political settlement, is what redeems the war from being only darkness. It doesn't make the war good. It doesn't justify the war. It doesn't erase the millions who died or the cities that burned or the innocence that was lost. But it reminds us that we are still human. That we can still choose, even in the smallest ways, to recognize each other across every boundary that history tries to enforce. Thomas Harrington died believing this. Klaus Schreiber, wherever he ended up, whatever happened to him in the final chaos of 1945, he must have believed it too. Because men do not give away their best chess pieces to their enemies. They give them to their friends. And sometimes, in the most broken moments of history, those 2 categories collapse into each other, and we discover that the enemy and the friend can be the same person, seen from different angles, illuminated by different lights. That is what the war taught Thomas. That is what he carried forward in a small wooden box for the rest of his life. That is what remains.